Chapter 18 of Across Mongolian Plains. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Kumanova. Across Mongolian Plains by Roy Chapman Andrews. Chapter 18. Wild Pigs, Animal and Human. Shanxi Province is famous for wild boar among the sportsmen of China. In the central part, there are low mountains and deep ravines, thickly forested with a scrub growth of pine and oak. The acorns are a favorite food of the pigs, and the pigs are a favorite food of the Chinese, and of foreigners too, for that matter. No domestic pork that I have ever tasted can excel a young acorn-fed wild pig. Even a full-grown sow is delicious, but beware of an old boar. Not only is he tough beyond description, but his flesh is so strong that it annoys me even to see it cooked. I tried to eat some boar meat once upon a time. That is why I feel so deeply about it. It is useless to hunt wild pig until the leaves are off the trees, for your only hope is to find them feeding on the hillsides in the morning or early evening. Then they will often come into the open or the thin forests, and you can have a fair shot across a ravine or from the summit of a hill. If they are in the brush, it is well nigh impossible to see them at all. A wild boar is very clever at eluding his pursuers, and for his size can carry off more lead and requires more killing than any other animal of which I know. Therefore, you may be sure of a decidedly interesting hunt. On the other hand, an unsuspecting pig is easy to stalk, for his eyesight is not good, his sense of smell is not much better, and he depends largely upon hearing to protect him from enemies. In Tianjin and Shanghai, there are several sportsmen who year after year go to try for record tusks. They are the real authorities on wild boar hunting. My own experience has been limited to perhaps a dozen pigs, killed in Korea, Mongolia, Celebes, and various parts of China. Harry Caldwell and I returned from our bighorn sheep and wapiti hunt on November 19. He was anxious to go with me for wild boar, but business required his presence in Foochow, and Everett Smith, who had been my companion on a trip to the Eastern Tombs the previous spring, volunteered to accompany me. We left on November 28 by the Peking-Hankow Railroad for Pingtingchou, arriving the following afternoon at 2 o'clock. There we obtained donkeys for pack and riding animals. All the traffic in this part of Shanxi is by mules or donkeys. As a result, the inns are small, with none of the spacious courtyards which we had found in the north of the province. They were not particularly dirty, but the open coal fires which burned in every kitchen sometimes drove us outside for a breath of untainted air. How it is possible for human beings to exist in rooms so filled with coal gas is beyond my knowledge. Of course, death from gas poisoning is not unusual, but I suppose the natives have become somewhat immune to its effects. Our destination was a tiny village in the mountains about 8 miles beyond Hoshan, a city of considerable size in the very center of the province. Taiyuanfu, the capital, at the end of the railway, is a famous place for pigs, but they have been hunted so persistently in recent years that few remain within less than 2 or 3 days' journey from the city. It was a 3 days' trip from the railroad to Hoshan, and there was little of interest to distinguish the road from any other in North China. It is always monotonous to travel with pack animals or carts, for they go so slowly that you can make only 2 or 3 miles an hour at best. If there happens to be shooting along the way, as there is in most parts of Shanxi, it helps to pass the time. We picked up a few pheasants, some chukars, and a dozen pigeons, but did not stop to do any real hunting until we entered a wooded valley and established ourselves in a fairly comfortable Chinese hut at the little village of Cao Cha Chuang. On the way in, we met a party of Christian brother missionaries who had been hunting in the vicinity for 5 days. They had seen 10 or 12 pigs and had killed a splendid boar weighing about 350 pounds as well as 2 roebuck. The mountains near the village had been so thoroughly hunted that there was little chance of finding pigs, but nevertheless, we decided to stay for a day or two. I killed a 2-year-old roebuck on the first afternoon, and the next morning, while Smith and I were resting on a mountain trail, one of our men saw an enormous wild boar trot across an open ridge and disappear into a heavily forested ravine. I selected a post on a projecting shoulder, while one Chinese went with Smith to pick up the trail of the pig. There were so many avenues of escape open to the boar that I had to remain where it was possible to watch a large expanse of the country. Smith had not yet reached the bottom of the ravine when the native who had remained with me suddenly began to gesticulate wildly and to point to a wooded slope directly in front of us. He hopped about like a man who had suddenly lost his mind and succeeded in keeping in front of me, so that I could see nothing but his waving arms and writhing body. Finally, seizing him by the collar, I threw him to the ground so violently that he realized his place was behind me. Then I saw the pig, running along a narrow trail, silhouetted against the snow, which lay thinly on the shaded side of the hill. He was easily 350 yards away, and I had little hope of hitting him, but I selected an open patch beyond a bit of cover and fired as he emerged. The boar squealed and plunged forward into the bushes. A moment later, he reappeared, zigzagging his way up the slope, and only visible through the trees when he crossed a patch of snow. I emptied the magazine of my rifle in a futile bombardment, but the boar crossed the summit and disappeared. We picked up his bloody trail and for 2 hours followed it through a tangled mass of scrub and thorns. It seemed certain that we must find him at any moment, for great red blotches stained the snow wherever he stopped to rest. At last, the trail led us across an open ridge, and the snow and blood suddenly ceased. We could not follow his footprints in the thick grass and abandoned the chase just before dark. 2 more days of unsuccessful hunting convinced us that the missionaries had driven the pigs to other cover. There was a region 12 miles away to which they might have gone, and we shifted camp to a village named Tsiloa, a mile or more from the scrub-covered hills which we wished to investigate. The natives of this part of the country were in no sense hunters. They were farmers who, now that the crops were harvested, had plenty of leisure time and were glad to roam the hills with us. Although their eyesight was remarkable, and they were able to see a pig twice as far as we could, they had no conception of stalking the game or how to hunt it. When we began to shoot, instead of watching the pigs, they were always so anxious to obtain the empty cartridge cases that a wild scramble ensued after every shot. They were like street boys fighting for a penny. It was a serious handicap for successful hunting, and they kept me in such a state of irritation that I never shot so badly in all my life. We found pigs at Tsiloa immediately. The carts went by road to the village, while Smith and I, with 2 Chinese, crossed the mountains. On the summit of a ridge not far from the village, we met 8 native hunters. 2 of them had ancient muzzle-loading guns, but the others only carried staves. Evidently, their method of hunting was to surround the pigs and drive them close up to the men with firearms. We persuaded one of the Chinese, a boy of 18, with cross eyes and a funny, dried-up little face, to accompany us, for our 2 guides wished to return that night to Cao Cha Chuang. He led us down a spur which projected northward from the main ridge, and in 10 minutes we discovered 5 pigs on the opposite side of a deep ravine. The sun lay warmly on the slope, and the animals were lazily rooting in the oak scrub. They were a happy family, a boar, a sow, and 3 half-grown piglets. We slipped quietly among the trees until we were directly opposite to them and not more than 200 yards away. The boar and the sow had disappeared behind a rocky corner, and the others were slowly following, so that the opportunity for a shot would soon be lost. Telling Smith to take the one on the left, I covered another which stood half facing me. At the roar of my rifle, the ravine was filled with wild squeals, and the pig rolled down the hill, bringing up against a tree. The boar rushed from behind the rock, and I fired quickly as he stood broadside on. He plunged out of sight, and the gorge was still. Smith had missed his pig and was very much disgusted. The 3 Chinese threw themselves down the slope, slipping and rolling over logs and stones, and were up the opposite hill before we reached the bottom of the ravine. They found the pig which I had killed, and a blood-splashed trail leading around the hill where the boar had disappeared. My pig was a splendid male in the rich red-brown coat of adolescence. The bullet had struck him amidships and shattered the hip on the opposite side. From the blood on the trail, we decided that I had shot the big boar through the center of the body about 10 inches behind the forelegs. We had learned by experience how much killing a full-grown pig required, and had no illusions about finding him dead a few yards away, even though both sides of his path were blotched with red at every step. Therefore, while the Chinese followed the trail, Smith and I sprinted across the next ridge into a thickly forested ravine to head off the boar. We took station several yards apart, and suddenly I heard Smith's rifle bang 6 times in quick succession. The Chinese had disturbed the pig from a patch of cover, and it had climbed the opposite hill slope in full view of Smith, who apparently had missed it every time. Missing a boar dodging about among the bushes is not such a difficult thing to do, and although poor Smith was too disgusted even to talk about it, I had a good deal of sympathy for him. We had little hopes of getting the animal when we climbed to the summit of the ridge and saw the tangle of brush into which it had disappeared, but nevertheless we followed the trail which was still showing blood. I was in front, and was just letting myself down a snow-covered boulder, when far below me I saw a huge sow and a young pig walking slowly through the trees. I turned quickly, lost my balance, and slipped feet first over the rock into a mass of thorns and scrub. A locomotive could not have made more noise, and I extricated myself just in time to see the 2 pigs disappear into a grove of pines. I was bleeding from a dozen scratches, but I climbed to the summit of the ridge and dashed forward, hoping to cut them off if they crossed below me. They did not appear, and we tried to drive them out from the cover into which they had made their way, but we never saw them again. It was already beginning to grow dark, and too late to pick up the trail of the wounded boar, so we had to call it a day and return to the village. One of our men carried my shotgun, and we killed 6 pheasants on the way back to camp. The birds had come into the open to feed, and small flocks were scattered along the valley every few hundred yards. We saw about 150 in less than an hour, besides a few chukars. I have never visited any part of China where pheasants were so plentiful as in this region. Had we been hunting birds, we could have killed 100 or more without the slightest difficulty during the time we were looking for pigs. We could not shoot, however, without the certainty of disturbing big game, and consequently we only killed pheasants when on the way back to camp. During the day, the birds kept well up toward the summits of the ridges, and only left the cover in the morning and evening. Our second hunt was very amusing, as well as successful. We met the same party of Chinese hunters early in the morning, and agreed to divide the meat of all the pigs we killed during the day if they would join forces with us. Among them was a tall, fine-looking young fellow, evidently the leader, who was a real hunter, the only one we found in the entire region. He knew instinctively where the pigs were, what they would do, and how to get them. He led us without a halt along the summit of the mountain, into a ravine and up a long slope to the crest of a knife-like ridge. Then he suddenly dropped in the grass and pointed across a canyon to a bare hillside. 2 pigs were there in plain sight, one a very large sow. They were fully 300 yards away and on the edge of a bushy patch toward which they were feeding slowly. Smith left me to hurry to the bottom of the canyon, where he could have a shot at close range if either one went down the hill, while I waited behind a stone. Before he was halfway down the slope, the sow moved toward the patch of cover into which the smaller pig had already disappeared. It must be then, if I was to have a shot at all. I fired rather hurriedly and registered a clean miss. Both pigs, instead of staying in the cover where they would have been safe, dashed down the open slope toward the bottom of the canyon. At my first shot, all 8 of the Chinese had leaped for the empty rifle shell and were rolling about like a pack of dogs after a bone. One of them struck my leg just as I fired the second time, and the bullet went into the air. I delivered a broadside of my choicest Chinese oaths, and the man drew off. I sent 3 shots after the fleeing sow, but she disappeared, unhurt. 1 shell remained in my rifle, and I saw the other pig running like a scared rabbit in the very bottom of the canyon. It was so far away that I could barely see the animal through my sights, but when I fired, it turned a complete somersault and lay still. The bullet had caught it squarely in the head. Meanwhile, Smith was having a lively time with the old sow. He had swung around a corner of rock just in time to meet the pig coming at full speed from the other side not 6 yards away. He tried to check himself, slipped, and sat down suddenly, but managed to fire once, breaking the animal's left foreleg. It disappeared into the brush with Smith after it. He began an intermittent bombardment which lasted half an hour. Bang, bang, bang. Then silence. Bang, bang, bang. Silence again. I wondered what it all meant, and finally ran down the bottom of the valley until I saw Smith opposite to me, just under the rim of the ravine. He was tearing madly through the brush not far behind the sow. As the animal appeared for an instant on the summit of a rise, he dropped on one knee and fired twice. Then I saw him race over the hill, leaping the bushes like a roebuck. Once he rolled 10 feet into a mass of thorn scrub, but he was up again in an instant, hurdling the brush and fallen logs, his eye on the pig. It was screamingly funny, and I was helpless with laughter. "Go it, Smith," I yelled. "Run him down. Catch him in your hands." He had no breath to waste in a reply, for just then he leaped a fallen log, and I saw the sow charge him viciously. The animal had been lying under a tree, almost done, but still had life enough to damage Smith badly if it had reached him. As the man landed on his feet, he fired again at the pig, which was almost on him. The bullet caught the brute in the shoulder at the base of the neck and rolled it over, but it struggled to its feet and ran uncertainly a few steps. Then it dropped in a little gully. By the time I had begun to climb the hill, Smith shouted that the pig might charge again, and I kept my rifle ready, but the animal was all in. I circled warily, and creeping up from behind, drove my hunting knife into its heart. Even then it struggled to get at me before it rolled over dead. Smith was streaming blood from a score of scratches, and his clothes were in ribbons, but his face was radiant. "I'd have chased the blasted pig clear to Peking," he said. "All my shells are gone, but I wasn't going to let him get away. If I hadn't kept that last cartridge, he'd have caught me, surely." It was fine enthusiasm and, If ever a man deserved his game, Smith deserved that sow. The animal had been shot in half a dozen places. 2 legs were broken, and at least 3 of the bullets had reached vital spots. Still, the brute kept on. Anyone who thinks pigs are easy to kill ought to try the ones in Shanxi. The sow weighed well over 300 pounds, and it required 6 men to carry the 2 pigs into camp. We got no more, although we saw 2 others, but still we felt the day had not been ill spent. As long as I live, I shall never forget Smith's hurdle race after that old sow. Although I killed 2 roebuck, the next day I returned to camp with rage in my heart. Smith and I had separated late in the afternoon, and I was hunting with an old Chinese when we discovered 3 pigs, a huge boar, a sow, and a shote, crossing an open hill. Crawling on my face, I reached a rock not 70 yards from the animals. At the first shot, the boar pitched over the bluff into a tangle of thorns, squealing wildly. My second bullet broke the shoulder of the sow, and I had a mad chase through a patch of scrub, but finally lost her. When I returned to get the big boar, I discovered my Chinese squatted on his haunches in the ravine. He blandly informed me that the pig could not be found. I spent the half hour of remaining daylight burrowing in the thorn scrub without success. I learned later that the native had concealed the dead pig under a mass of stones, and that during the night he and his confreres had carried it away. Moreover, after we left, they also got the sow which I had wounded. Although at the time I did not suspect the man's perfidy, nevertheless it was apparent that he had not kept his eyes on the boar as I had told him to do. Otherwise, the pig could not have possibly escaped. We had 1 more day of hunting because Smith had obtained 2 weeks' leave. The next morning dawned dark and cloudy with spurts of hail, just the sort of weather in which animals prefer to stay comfortably snuggled under a bush in the thickest cover. Consequently, we saw nothing all day except 1 roebuck, which I killed. It was running at full speed when I fired, and it disappeared over the crest of a hill without a sign of injury. Smith was waiting on the other side, and I wondered why he did not shoot, until we reached the summit and discovered the deer lying dead in the grass. Smith had seen the buck plunge over the ridge, and just as he was about to fire, it collapsed. We found that my bullet had completely smashed the heart, yet the animal had run more than 100 yards. As it fell, one of its antlers had been knocked off, and the other was so loose that it dropped in my hand when I lifted the head. This was on December 11. The other bucks which I had killed still wore their antlers, but probably they would all have been shed before Christmas. The growth takes place during the winter, and the velvet is all off the new antlers by the following May. On the way back to camp, we saw a huge boar standing on an open hillside. Smith and I fired hurriedly, and both missed a perfectly easy shot. With one of the Chinese, I circled the ridge, while Smith took up the animal's trail. We arrived on the edge of a deep ravine, just as the boar appeared in the very bottom. I fired as it rushed through the bushes, and the pig squealed but never hesitated. The second shot struck behind it, but at the third it squealed again and dived into a patch of cover. When we reached the spot, we found a great pool of blood and bits of entrails, but no pig. A broad red patch led through the snow, and we followed, expecting at every step to find the animal dead. Instead, the track carried us down the hill, up the bottom of a ravine, and onto a hill bare of snow, but thickly covered with oak scrub. While Smith and I circled ahead to intercept the pig, the Chinese followed the trail. It was almost dark when we went back to the men, who announced that the blood had ceased and that they had lost the track. It seemed incredible, but they had so trampled the trail where it left the snow that we could not find it again in the gloom. Then Smith and I suspected what we eventually found to be true, that is, that the men had discovered the dead pig and had purposely led us astray. We had no proof, however, and they denied the charge so violently that we began to think our suspicions were unfounded. We had to leave at daylight next morning in order to reach Peking before Smith's leave expired. 2 days after we left, one of my friends arrived at Khao Chia Chuang, where we had first hunted, and reported that the Chinese had brought in all 4 of the pigs which we had wounded. One of them, probably the boar we lost on the last night, was an enormous animal which the natives said weighed more than 500 pounds. Of course, this could not have been true, but it probably did reach nearly 400 pounds. What Smith and I said when we learned that the scoundrels had cheated us would not look well in print. However, it taught us several things about boar hunting which will prove of value in the future. The Chinese can sell wild pig meat for a very high price, since it is considered to be a great delicacy. Therefore, if I wound a pig in the future, I shall myself follow its trail to the bitter end. Moreover, I learned that to knock over a wild boar and keep him down for good, one needs a heavy rifle. The bullet of my 6.5mm Monmouthshire, which has proved to be a wonderful killer for anything up to and including sheep, has not weight enough behind it to stop a pig in its tracks. These animals have such wonderful vitality that, even though shot in a vital spot, they can travel an unbelievable distance. Next time, I shall carry a rifle especially designed for pigs and thieving Chinese. End of Chapter 18. Recorded by Laura Kumanova, San Francisco, February 14, 2021.
Chapter 19 of Across Mongolian Plains. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Across Mongolian Plains by Roy Chapman Andrews. Chapter 19. The Hunting Park of the Eastern Tombs. The sunshine of an early spring day was flooding the flower-filled courtyards of Duke Zaizi's palace in Peking when Dr. G. D. Wilder, Everett Smith, and I alighted from our car at the huge brass-bound gate. We came by motor instead of rickshaw, for we were on an official visit which had been arranged by the American minister. We would have suffered much loss of face had we come in any lesser vehicle than an automobile, for we were to be received by a royal highness, an imperial duke, and a man in whose veins flowed the bluest of Manchu blood. Although living in retirement, Duke Zaizi is still a powerful and a respected man. We were ushered through court after court into a large reception hall, furnished in semi-foreign style but in excellent taste. A few moments later the Duke entered, dressed in a simple gown of dark blue silk. Had I met him casually on the street, I should have known he was a personality. His high-bred features were those of a maker of history, of a man who has faced the ruin of his own ambitions, who has seen his emperor deposed and his dynasty shattered, but who has lost not one whit of his poise or self-esteem. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, and there was a royal courtesy in his greeting which inspired profound respect. Had he been marked for death in the Revolution, I am sure that he would have received his executioners in the same calm way that he met us in the reception hall. He listened with a courteous interest while we explained the object of our visit. We had come, we told him, to ask permission to collect natural history specimens in the great hunting park at the Tung Ling Eastern Tombs. Here and at the His Ling, or Western Tombs, the Manchu emperors and their royal consorts sleep in splendid mausoleums among the fragrant pines. The emperors are buried at the lower end of a vast walled park, more than 100 miles in length. True to their reverence for the dead, the Chinese conquerors have never touched these sacred spots, and doubtless will never do so. They belong unquestionably to the Manchus, even if their dynasty has been overthrown by force of arms. According to custom, some member of the royal court is always in residence at the Eastern Tombs. This fact Zaizi gravely explained, and said that he would commend us in a letter to Duke Chao, who would be glad to grant us the privileges we asked. Then, by touching his teacup to his lips, he indicated that our interview was ended. With the same courtesy he would have shown to a visiting diplomat, he ushered us through the courtyards, while at each doorway we begged him to return. Such is the custom in China. That same afternoon a messenger from the Duke arrived at my house in Wu Liang, Taizhen Hu Tang, bearing a letter beautifully written in Chinese characters. Everett Smith and I left next morning for the Eastern Tombs. We went by train to Tung Chou, 12 miles away, where a mafu was waiting with our ponies and a cart for baggage. The way to the Tung Ling is a delight, for along it North China country life passes before one in a panoramic completeness. For centuries this road has been an imperial highway. I could imagine the gorgeous processions that had passed over it, and the pomp and ceremony of the visits of the living emperors to the resting places of the dead. Most vivid of all was the picture in my mind of the last great funeral only 9 years before. I could see the imperial yellow bier slowly, solemnly borne over the gray Peking hills. In it lay the dead body of the Dowager Empress, Zhu He, most dreaded, yet most beloved, the greatest empress of the last century, the woman who tasted of life and power through the sweetest joys to their bitter core. We spent the first night at an inn on the outskirts of a tiny village. It was a clean inn, too, very different from those in South China. The great courtyard was crowded with arriving carts. In the kitchen, dozens of tired mafus were noisily gulping huge bowls of macaroni, and others, stretched upon the kang, had already become shapeless bundles of dirty rags. After dinner, Smith and I wandered outside the court. An open-air theatre was in full operation a few yards from the inn, and all the village had gathered in the street. But we were of more interest to the audience than the drama itself, and in an instant a score of men and women had surrounded us. They were all good-natured, but frankly curious. Finally an old man joined the crowd. "Why," said he, "there are 2 foreigners." Immediately the hum of voices ceased, for age was speaking. "They've got foreign clothes," he exclaimed. "And what funny hats! It is true that foreign hats are much bigger than Chinese caps, and they cost a lot more, too. See that gun the tall one is carrying? He could shoot those pigeons over there as easily as not, all of them with one shot. Probably he will in a minute." The old man continued the lecture until we strolled back to the inn. Undoubtedly he is still discussing us, for there is little to talk about in a Chinese village, except crops and weather and local gossip. We reached the Eastern Tombs in the late afternoon of the same day. Emerging from a rocky gateway on the summit of a hill, we had the whole panorama of the Tung Ling spread out before us. It was like a vast green sea where wave after wave of splendid forest rolled away to the blue haze of distant mountains. The islands in this forest ocean were the yellow-roofed tombs, which gave back the sun in 1,000 points of golden light. After the monotonous brown of the bare North China hills, the vivid green of the trees was as refreshing as finding an unknown oasis in a sandy desert. To the right was the picturesque village of Ma Lin Yu, the residence of Duke Chao. From the wide veranda of the charming temple which we were invited to occupy, we could look across the brown village to the splendid park and the glistening yellow roofs of the imperial tombs. We found next day that it is a veritable paradise, a spot of exquisite beauty where profound artistic sentiment has been magnificently expressed. Broad paved avenues, bordered by colossal animals sculptured in snow-white marble, lead through the trees to imposing gates of red and gold. There is, too, a delightful appreciation of climax. As one walks up a spacious avenue, passing through gate after gate, each more magnificent than the last, one is being prepared by this cumulative splendor for the tomb itself. One feels everywhere the dignity of space. There is no smallness, no crowding. One feels the greatness of the people that has done these things, a race that looks at life and death with a vision as broad as the skies themselves. At the Tung Ling, nature has worked hand in hand with man to produce a harmonious whole. Most of the trees about the tombs have been planted, but the work has been cleverly done. There is nothing glaringly artificial, and you feel as though you were in a well-groomed forest where every tree has grown just where, in nature's scheme of things, it ought to be. Although the tombs are alike in general plan, they are, at the same time, as individual as were the emperors themselves. Each is a subtle expression of the character of the one who sleeps beneath the yellow roof. The tomb of Qianlong, the artist emperor, lies not far away from that of the Empress Dowager. Stately, beautiful in its simplicity, it is an indication of his life and deeds. In striking contrast is the palace built by the Empress for her eternal dwelling. A woman of iron will, holding her place by force and intrigue, a lover of lavish display, she has expressed it all in her gorgeous tomb. The extravagance of its decoration and the wealth of gold and silver seemed to declare to all the world her desire to be known even in death as the greatest of the great. It is said that her tomb cost $10,000,000, and I can well believe it. But 100 years from now, when Qianlong's mausoleum, like the painting of an old master, has grown even more beautiful by the touch of age, that of the Empress will be worn and tarnished. Charmed with the calm, the peace, the exquisite beauty of the spot, we spent a delightful day wandering among the red and gold pavilions. But fascinating as were the tombs, we were really concerned with the hinterland, the hunting park itself. 60 miles to the north, but still within the walls, are towering mountains and glorious forests. These were what we had come to see. All day, behind 3 tiny donkeys, we followed a tortuous, foaming stream in the bottom of a splendid valley, ever going upward. At night we slept in the open, and next day crossed the mountain into a forest of oak and pine, sprinkled with silver birches. Hundreds of woodcutters passed us on the trail, each carrying a single log upon his back. Before we reached the village of Xinglun-shan, we came into an area of desolation. Thousands of splendid trees were lying in a chaos of charred and blackened trunks. It was the wantonness of it all that depressed and horrified me. The reason was perfectly apparent. On every bit of open ground Manchu farmers were at work with plow and hoe. The land was being cleared for cultivation, regardless of all else. North China has very little timber, so little, in fact, that one longs passionately to get away from the bare hills. Yet in this forest paradise the trees were being sacrificed relentlessly, simply to obtain a few more acres on which the farmer could grow his crops. If it had to be done, and heaven knows it need not have been, the trees might have been utilized for timber. Many have been cut, of course, but thousands upon thousands have been burned simply to clear the hillside. At Xinglung-shan we met our hunters and continued up the valley for 3 hours. With every mile there were fewer open spaces. We had come to a region of vast mountains, gloomy valleys, and heavy forests. The scenery was superb. It thrilled me as did the mountains of Yunnan and the gorges of the Yangtze. Yet all this grandeur is less than 100 miles from Peking. On a little ridge between the 2 foaming streams we made our camp in the forest. From the door of the tent we could look over the tops of the trees into the blue distance of the valley. Behind us was a wall of forest broken only by the winding corridor of the mountain torrent. We had come to the Tungling specially to obtain specimens of the Sika deer, Cervus hortilorum, and the Reeves pheasant, Cermaticus reevesi, the former a noble animal, about the size of our Virginia deer in America, has become exceedingly rare in North China. The latter, one of the most beautiful of living birds, is found now in only 2 localities, near Aichang on the Yangtze River, and at the Tungling. When the forests of the eastern tombs have been cleared, the species will be extinct in all North China. Early in the morning we left with 6 hunters. Our way led up the bottom of the valley toward a mountain ridge north of camp. As we walked along the trail, suddenly one of the hunters caught me by the arm and whispered, "Sang Chi," wild chicken. There was a whir of wings, a flash of gold, and I registered a clean miss. The bird alighted on the mountainside, and in the bliss of ignorance Smith and I dashed after it. 10 minutes later we were exhausted from the climb, and the pheasant had disappeared. We learn soon that it is useless to chase a Rhees pheasant when it has once been flushed, for it will invariably make for a mountainside, run rapidly to the top, and once over the summit, fly to another ridge. On the way home I got my first pheasant, and an hour later put up half a dozen. I should have had 2 more, but instead of shooting I only stared, fascinated by the beauty of the thing I saw. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun was drawing oblique paths of shimmering golden light among the trees. In a clearing near the summit of a wooded shoulder, I saw 6 pheasants feeding, and I realized that, by skirting the base of the ridge, I could slip up from behind and force them to fly across the open valley. The stalk progressed according to schedule. When I crossed the ridge, there was a whir of wings, and 6 birds shot into the air not 30 feet away. The sun, glancing on their yellow backs and streaming plumes, transformed them into golden balls, each one with a comet trail of living fire. The picture was so indescribably beautiful that I watched them sail across the valley with a gun idle in my hands. Not for worlds would I have turned one of those glorious birds into a crumpled mass of flesh and feathers. For centuries the barred tail plumes, which sometimes are 6 feet long, have been worn by Chinese actors, and the bird is famous in their literature. It will be a real tragedy when this species has passed out of the fauna of North China, as it will do inevitably if the wanton destructionness of the Tung-Ling forest is continued unchecked. The next afternoon 4 sika deer gave me a hard chase up and down 3 mountain ridges. Finally we located the animals in a deep valley, and I had an opportunity to examine them through my glasses. Much to my disgust I saw that the velvet was not yet off the antlers, and that their winter coats were only partly shed. They were valueless as specimens, and forthwith I abandoned the hunt. Before leaving Peking I had visited the zoological garden to make sure that the captive sika had assumed their summer dress and antlers. But at the Tung-Ling spring had not yet arrived, and the animals were late in losing their winter hair. In summer the sika is the most beautiful of all deer. Its bright red body, spotted with white, is, when seen among the green leaves of the forest, one of the loveliest things in nature. We wished to obtain a group of these splendid animals for the new Hall of Asiatic Life in the American Museum of Natural History, but the specimens had to be in perfect summer dress. My hunter was disgusted beyond expression when I refused to shoot the deer. The antlers of the sika, when in the velvet, are of greater value to the natives than those of any other species. A good pair of horns in full velvet sometimes sells for as much as $450. The growing antlers are called shu qiao, blood horns, by the Chinese, who consider them of the highest efficacy as a remedy for certain diseases. Therefore the animals are persecuted relentlessly, and very few remain even in the Tung-Ling. The antlers of the wapiti are also of great value to the native druggist, but strangely enough they care little for those of the moose and the roebuck. Hundreds of thousands of deer horns are sent from the interior provinces of China to be sold in the large cities, and the complete extermination of certain species is only a matter of a few decades. Moreover, the female elk, just before the calving season, receive unmerciful persecution, for it is believed that the unborn fawns have great medicinal properties. Since the roebuck at the Tung-Ling were in the same condition as the sika, they were useless for our purposes. The goral, however, which live high up on the rocky peaks, had not begun to shed their hair, and they gave us good shooting. One beautiful morning Smith killed a splendid ram just above our camp. We had often looked at a ragged granite outcrop, sparsely covered with spruce and pine trees, which towered 1,000 feet above us. We were sure there must be a goral somewhere on the ridge, and the hunters told us that they sometimes killed them there. It was a stiff climb, and we were glad to rest when we reached the summit. The old hunter placed Smith opposite an almost perpendicular face of rock, and stationed me beyond him on the other side. 3 beaters had climbed the mountain a mile below us, and were driving up the ridge. For half an hour I lay stretched out in the sun, luxuriating in the warmth and breathing in the fragrant odor of the pines, while I was lazily watching a Chinese green woodpecker searching for grubs in a tree nearby. There came the faintest sound of a loosened pebble on the cliff above my head. Instantly I was alert and tense. A second later, Smith's rifle banged once. Then all was still. In a few moments he shouted to me that he had fired at a big goral, but that it had disappeared behind the ridge, and he was afraid it had not been hit. The old hunter, however, had seen the animal scramble into a tiny grove of pine trees. As it had not emerged, I was sure the goral was wounded, and when the men climbed up the cliff they found it dead, bored neatly through the center of the chest. Gorals, sika, and roebuck are by no means the only big-game animals in the Tongling. Bears and leopards are not uncommon, and occasionally a tiger is killed by the natives. Among other species is a huge flying squirrel, nearly 3 feet long, badgers, and chipmunks, a beautiful squirrel with tufted ears which is almost black in summer and now is very rare, and dozens of small animals. But perhaps most interesting of all the creatures of these noble forests are the only wild monkeys to be found in northeastern China. The birds are remarkable in variety and numbers. Besides the Reeve's pheasant, of which I have spoken, there are 2 other species of this most beautiful family. One, the common ring-necked pheasant, is very abundant. The other is the rare Pucracia, a gray bird with a dark red breast, and a yellow striped head surmounted by a conspicuous crest. It is purely a mountain form, requiring a mixed forest of pine and oak, and although more widely distributed than the Reeve's pheasant, it occurs in comparatively few localities of North China. One morning, as Smith and I were coming back from hunting, we saw our 3 boys perched upon a ledge above the stream, peering into the water. They called to us, "Would you like some fish?" "Of course," we answered, "but how can you get them?" In a second they had slipped from the rock and were stripping off their clothes. Then one went to the shallows at the lower end of the pool and began to beat the surface with a leafy branch, while the other 2 crouched on the boulders in midstream. Suddenly one of the boys plunged his head and arms into the water, and emerged with a beautiful speckled trout clutched tightly in both hands. He'd seen the fish swim beneath the rock where it was cornered, and had caught it before it could escape. For an hour the 2 boys sat like kingfishers, absolutely motionless, except when they dived into the water. Of course they often missed, but when they were ready to go home they had 8 beautiful trout, several of them weighing as much as 2 pounds. The stream was full of fish, and we would have given worlds for a rod and flies. Lou baked a loaf of cornbread in his curious little oven made from a standard oil tin. We found a jar of honey in our stores. Brook trout fried in deep bacon fat, regular Southern-style cornbread and honey, apple pie, coffee, and cigarettes, the hardships of camping in the Orient. When we had been in camp a week, we awoke one morning to find a heavy cloud of smoke drifting up the valley. Evidently a tremendous fire was raging, and Smith and I set out at once on a tour of investigation. A mile down the valley we saw the whole mountainside ablaze. It was a beautiful sight, I admit, but the destruction of that magnificent forest appalled us. Fortunately, the wind was blowing strongly from the east, and there was no danger that the fire might sweep northward in the direction of our camp. As we emerged into a tiny clearing, occupied by a single log hut, we saw 2 Chinese sitting on their heels, placidly watching the roaring furnace across the valley. With a good deal of excitement, we asked them how the fire possibly could have originated. "Oh," said one, "we started it ourselves." "In the name of the 5 gods, why did you do it?" Smith asked. "Well, you see," returned the Chinese, "there was quite a lot of brush here in our clearing, and we had to get rid of it. Today the wind was right, so we set it on fire." "But don't you see that you have burned up that whole mountain side, destroyed thousands of trees, and absolutely ruined this end of the valley?" "Oh, yes, but never mind. It can't be helped," the native answered. Then I exploded. I frankly confessed that I cursed that Chinese and all his ancestors, which is the only proper way to curse in China. I assured him that he was an old rabbit, and that his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather were rabbits. To tell a man that he is even remotely connected with a rabbit is decidedly uncomplimentary in China. But when it was all said, I had accomplished nothing. The man looked at me in blank amazement, as though I had suddenly lost my mind. He had not the faintest idea that burning up that beautiful forest was reprehensible in the slightest degree. To him and all his kind, the only thing worth while was to clear that bit of land in the valley. If every tree on the mountain was destroyed in the process, what difference did it make? It would be done eventually anyway. Land, whether it be on a hill or in a valley, was made to grow crops, and to be cultivated by Chinese farmers. The wanton destruction which is being wrought at the Tung Ling makes me sick at heart. Here is one of the most beautiful spots in all China, within less than 100 miles of Peking, which is being ruined utterly as fast as axe and fire can do the work. One can travel the length and breadth of the whole republic, and not find elsewhere so much glorious scenery in so small a space. Moreover, it is the last sanctuary of much of North China's wildlife. When the forests of the Tung Ling are gone, half a dozen species of birds and mammals will become extinct. How much of the original flora of North China exists today only in these forests I would not dare to say, for I am not a botanist, but it can hardly be less than the fauna of which I know. If China could but realize before it is too late how priceless a treasure is being hewed and burned to nothingness, and take the first step in conservation by making a national park of the eastern tombs. Politically there are difficulties, it is true. The Tung Ling and all the surroundings, as I have said, belong unquestionably to the Manchus, and they can do as they wish with their own. But it is largely a question of money, and were the Republic to pay the price for the forests and mountains beyond the tombs, it would not be difficult to do the rest. No country on earth ever had a more splendid opportunity to create for the generations of the present and the future a living memorial to its glorious past. End of Chapter 19. End of Across Mongolian Plains by Roy Chapman Andrews.